The death rain was falling heavier now, turning the narrow road into a dark ribbon of mud and puddles. Sundar stood at the threshold of the little tea shop for only a moment before stepping into the storm. The man's hand was still gripping the old grandma's thin wrist, his thick fingers digging into her fragile skin as he dragged her through the mud. She stumbled behind him, her small frame almost swallowed by her wet sari, her feet slipping as she tried to keep up. Sundar's eyes narrowed as he watched them moving toward a black car parked under a broken street lamp. The headlights glowed faintly through the rain, and inside the car, he could just barely make out two more men, sitting motionless, their faces shadowed. Sundar's breath came out in a thin white mist as he shouted, "Stop!" But his voice was drowned by the storm. Still, the man dragging the grandma glanced back over his shoulder, annoyed, but didn't stop walking. Sundar felt heat rising in his chest. He began walking faster, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud, then running, splashing water all around him. He caught up just as the man opened the back door of the car. Sundar reached out and grabbed the man's arm. The man spun around, surprised, his face hardening instantly. "What do you want?" he growled. "This is none of your business." The grandma was shaking now, her eyes wide with fear. She tried to speak but only managed a weak whisper, "Please, let me go." Sundar positioned himself between the man and the grandma, raising a hand slightly in a calm gesture. "She doesn't want to go with you," he said evenly. "Let her go." The man laughed bitterly and shook his head. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and dangerous. She owes me more than you could imagine. Now step aside." Sundar's eyes stayed on the man, steady, unblinking. The man was taller than Sundar, broader too, with a thick gold chain visible around his neck and a scar cutting through one eyebrow. Sundar could smell alcohol on his breath, mixed with the acrid scent of sweat and rain. Sundar kept his voice calm but firm. "How much does she owe you?" he asked softly. The man barked a laugh and stepped closer. "More than you can pay," he sneered. "This isn't about money anymore. It's about respect." She thought she could borrow from me and then hide behind her tears. "No, it doesn't work like that." Sundar slipped a hand into his pocket, feeling for his phone and wallet. "Tell me the amount," he said. "I'll pay you now. Whatever she owes, I'll settle it." His words hung in the wet air, quiet but clear. The man's grin widened, cruel and mocking. "You think you can fix everything with money?" He spat, taking another step closer, until their faces were only inches apart. "You think you can just pay me off and walk away? No, she disrespected me. She needs to learn what happens when you disrespect me." Sundar could feel the grandma clutching the edge of his jacket behind him, her fingers trembling. The man reached out and shoved Sundar hard in the chest, forcing him back a step. "You don't belong here," the man said, his voice a growl now. "You're just some outsider sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Sundar steadied himself, straightening his jacket slowly. "Maybe," he said simply, "but she does belong here, and you won't touch her again." The man's face darkened, and he lunged forward as if to grab Sundar's collar, but Sundar didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his voice and leaned slightly forward. "I'm going to ask you one last time," he said quietly. "How much does she owe you?" The man froze for a second, taken off guard by Sundar's calmness. He glanced toward the car, then back at Sundar. The grandma's breathing was shallow, her eyes darting between the two of them. Finally, the man hissed, 100,000. With interest, she borrowed 30, and now it's 100. That's how it works. Sundar nodded slowly. "Fine," he said, pulling out his phone. "Give me your account number. I'll transfer it now." But the man snorted and crossed his arms. "No, it's not about the money anymore. She humiliated me. She made me wait. You think I'm just some beggar you can buy off." His eyes glittered with fury, and he spat on the ground. "She's coming with me tonight." The grandma whimpered, her knees buckling slightly. Sundar caught her by the arm and steadied her, keeping himself between her and the man. "Listen to me," Sundar said, his voice steady as stone. "If you touch her again, you will regret it. I promise you." The man stared at Sundar for a long moment, then laughed a deep, ugly sound that carried over the rain. "You're going to make me regret it," he said. "Look at you. Fancy clothes, soft hands. You have no idea what kind of place this is." "Maybe," Sundar replied softly. "But maybe you have no idea who I am." For the first time, the man hesitated. He tilted his head slightly, studying Sundar's face, as if trying to place him. But then he shook his head and barked, "Doesn't matter, you'll both regret it." Just then, a flash of blue light cut through the rain. The sound of tires crunching over gravel filled the street. A police car rolled slowly to a stop a few feet away, its headlights shining on the scene. Two officers stepped out, adjusting their caps, their eyes already fixed on the man holding the grandma. The man stiffened, his hands balling into fists. Sundar slipped his phone back into his pocket, his eyes never leaving the man's face. The man's jaw tightened as he glanced at the officers, then back at Sundar. "You called them," he muttered, his voice low with fury. "You made a big mistake." Sundar said nothing, only stared back. his expression calm but unyielding. The rain dripped from his hair and ran down the side of his face, but his eyes never wavered. The man dropped the grandma's arm and took a step back, then another, his lips curling into a sneer. "You don't know who I am?" he hissed under his breath. Backing toward the car, Sundar finally spoke, his voice even softer now, but every word sharp as a blade. "And you," he said, "don't know who I am either." The man's eyes narrowed, his nostrils flaring as he climbed into the car. The engine roared to life, and the car peeled away into the darkness, splashing water high into the air. The two officers exchanged glances, then turned to Sundar, waiting for an explanation. Sundar didn't speak right away. He turned to the grandma, who was clutching her hands together, shaking, her face pale and wet with rain and tears. He rested a hand gently on her shoulder and said quietly, "It's going to be okay, I promise." Behind them, the blue lights of the police car continued to spin, painting the wet street in shifting shades of light and shadow. The air was thick with tension and the faint smell of ozone, as if something bigger, darker, was still waiting just around the corner. And deep in the night, not far away, the black car slowed to a stop under a bridge. Inside, the man sat in silence. For a long time, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Finally, he pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and growled into the receiver. "He's going to pay for this. I don't care who he is." The line crackled, then a low voice on the other end replied, "Then we'll make sure he does." The man smiled faintly, his teeth flashing in the dark. "Good," he said, "because this is just the beginning." The secret storm passed by morning, but the streets still glistened with puddles that reflected the dull gray sky. The air smelled of wet earth and faint smoke from the vendors lighting their morning fires. Sundar stood in front of the small house, his shoes damp and his mind heavy. The grandma walked slowly ahead of him, her back slightly hunched, clutching the edge of her sari tightly in one hand. Her other hand trembled as she fumbled with the rusted latch on her wooden door. Sundar watched quietly, offering no help yet, not because he didn't want to, but because he sensed that her pride was the only thing she had left. After a few moments of struggling, she finally managed to push the door open, and she glanced up at him with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Come in," she whispered. Stepping aside, he ducked slightly to enter, his eyes adjusting to the dim light inside. The house smelled faintly of incense and old wood. The walls were bare, except for a faded picture of a man and woman, younger versions of the grandma and her late husband, standing under a tree on what must have been their wedding day. The floor was cold and uneven, with cracks running through the concrete. A single cot stood in the corner, covered in a thin, worn blanket. On a low shelf, a few steel plates and cups were stacked neatly. There was no sign of excess, no sign of comfort, only survival. She gestured toward the cot. "Sit," she said softly, her voice cracking just a little. "I'll make tea." He sat on the edge of the cot, his hands resting on his knees, watching her move around the tiny space. She struck a match and lit the small kerosene stove. The blue flame flickered weakly as she boiled water in a dented kettle. She opened a jar and spooned out the last bits of tea leaves into the bubbling water. Sundar noticed that the jar was nearly empty. She worked with a quiet dignity, not looking at him as she spoke. "You shouldn't have interfered last night," she murmured. "That man, he's dangerous. You don't understand what you've done." Sundar leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his voice low. "Maybe, but I couldn't just stand there." She finally glanced at him, her eyes searching his face. "But why?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "You don't even know me." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied the cracked floor for a moment, then looked up and said simply, "No one deserves to be treated like that." She poured the weak tea into 2 cups and handed him one. Her hands shook slightly as she sat opposite him on a low stool. For a moment, they sat in silence, sipping the hot, bitter liquid. Outside, the sound of morning traffic drifted through. The thin walls, bicycle bells, a distant train horn, children laughing on their way to school. Finally, he asked gently, "What happened? How did it come to this?" She let out a long breath, setting her cup down on the floor. "After my husband died last year," she began, "everything fell apart. We had some savings, but the hospital bills took it all. My children," her voice faltered, and she swallowed hard. "My children went away. They said they couldn't take care of me. Said they had their own lives. So I started selling vegetables. At the market, I thought it would be enough." She shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on a crack in the wall. "But it wasn't enough. I couldn't keep up with the rent, the debts, so I borrowed. Just a little, at first, then more, and more, and before I knew it, I was trapped." Sundar listened quietly, his fingers tightening around the warm cup. "Why didn't you ask for help from someone else?" he asked softly. She gave a bitter laugh, short and quiet. "Help," she said, almost spitting the word. "There's no help for people like me. I raised my children with everything I had, and still they left. The neighbors pity me, but they don't want to get involved. No one wants to be near bad luck." She turned her face toward the faded wedding photo on the wall. The ring I gave to the shopkeeper. It was the only thing left of my husband. He bought it for me with his first month's pay. It wasn't worth much, but it was mine, and now. Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. Sundar felt something heavy settle in his chest. He set his cup down and leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll help you," he said. "You won't have to go through this alone." She dropped her hands, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why?" she asked again, her voice hoarse. "Why would you do that?" He gave her a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Because someone once helped me when I was lost," he said quietly, "and I promised myself I would never forget." She stared at him for a long moment, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she looked away, her cheeks flushed with shame. "I can't accept charity," she muttered. "It's not charity," he said gently. "It's respect." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the faint hiss of the stove flame dying down. Then Sundar took out his phone and began typing quietly, making a series of calls. He spoke in soft tones, using words she didn't fully understand. Numbers, names, instructions. When he was done, he put the phone away and smiled at her. "Someone will come by this afternoon to repair your roof," he said. "There will also be food delivered for a few weeks, just to get you back on your feet, and I've opened a small account in your name. You don't have to worry about paying it back." She shook her head slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Now, I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. He reached across the narrow space and took her hand gently. "You don't have to," he said. "Just promise me you'll keep going." She nodded weakly, wiping her eyes with the edge of her sari. After a while, she stood and began fussing with the kettle again, clearly embarrassed by her own tears. Sundar stood as well, brushing off his trousers. He glanced once more at the wedding photo on the wall and smiled faintly. "He looks like a kind man," he said softly. She followed his gaze and her eyes softened. "He was," she murmured. The morning light had grown brighter now, streaming through the small window and casting warm patterns on the floor. Sundar checked his phone again and sighed. He could feel the weight of his other life, the meetings, the emails, the obligations, pressing at the edges of his mind, but he pushed it aside for now. She watched him curiously as he slipped his phone back into his pocket. "You're not from here, are you?" she asked hesitantly. He paused, then gave her a small smile. "Maybe I am," he said quietly. "Maybe I'm not." Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him. "You talk like someone important," she said after a moment. He chuckled softly. "Only to some people," he replied. "To others, I'm just someone who buys tea in the rain." She tilted her head, still watching him with that searching look. "But who are you really?" she asked. Again, her voice almost a whisper. He hesitated this time. His fingers brushed the inside of his jacket, and he pulled out his wallet. He opened it slowly, then slid an identification card across the table to her. She took it with trembling hands, her eyes lowering to read the name. And then she froze. Her eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat, and her hands began to shake. She looked up at him, her lips parted, but no sound coming out. Finally, in a voice that cracked and trembled, she whispered, "You're Sundar Pichai." He met her gaze steadily, his face calm, his smile faint. He said nothing, only gave a small nod. She clutched the card to her chest, her tears falling freely now. The kettle hissed and sputtered on the stove behind them, the thin wisp of steam curling upward, unnoticed. Outside, the streets bustled with life. Vendors calling out their wares, children chasing each other, bicycles clattering over wet stones, but inside that small house, the air was heavy with quiet astonishment, and the weight of a secret revealed. The promised sun was just beginning to climb over the rooftops. When Sundar returned to the little house, the streets were already alive with noise and color, the clatter of bicycle wheels, the sweet scent of roasted peanuts, the cries of vendors calling out their morning prices. Children ran past him, barefoot, laughing, chasing a ball that skidded across the wet street. Sundar walked slowly, carrying a small basket of fresh groceries in one hand and a quiet determination in his heart. When he reached the grandma's door, he noticed it was already open. She was sitting outside on a wooden stool, her hands busy, shelling peas into a bowl. Her sari looked cleaner today, though still faded, and her hair was tied back neatly. She glanced up when she saw him and froze, her hands stilling over the bowl. For a moment she just stared, as if she wasn't sure if he was real. And then she quickly stood, wiping her hands on her sari. "You came back," she said softly, almost as if she hadn't expected him to. He nodded and held out the basket too. "Her breakfast?" he said simply. She hesitated, then reached out and took the basket, her fingers brushing his. "You shouldn't trouble yourself," she murmured. He shook his head slightly. "It's no trouble," he replied. "Besides, you've been troubling yourself alone for too long." Her eyes softened at that, though she said nothing. She turned and led him inside, placing the basket on the table. He followed, noticing how she moved with quiet pride, even in this small, bare space. He took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, then started unpacking the food: tomatoes, onions, fresh bread, milk, and eggs. Sit, she said after a moment. I'll cook. But Sundar shook his head. Today, he said. You rest. Let me help. She gave him a skeptical look, one eyebrow arched, but didn't argue further. She sat on the stool again and watched him moving about her kitchen with surprising ease. He cracked eggs into a bowl, whisked them briskly, chopped onions and tomatoes. With practiced hands, she was quiet at first, but after a while she began to speak softly at first, then more openly. I used to cook every morning for my husband, she said. He liked his eggs just so, not too runny, not too dry. He used to say I made the best tea in the neighborhood. Sundar glanced at her with a faint smile. I believe it, he said. She shook her head gently, her eyes distant. We didn't have much, but we were happy. We laughed a lot. We dreamed a lot, but dreams. Her voice trailed off, and she fell silent. Sundar placed a warm plate in front of her and sat down opposite. Dreams change, he said softly, but they don't have to disappear. She looked at him curiously. Do you dream? She asked. He thought about that for a moment before answering. I used to, he said quietly, and then I started chasing them, and then they started chasing me. She tilted her head slightly, trying to understand. And now? She asked. He smiled faintly. Now I'm trying to remember why I started. They ate quietly for a while, the simple food filling the air with warmth. After breakfast, Sundar stood and brushed his hands off. Come, he said, let's go to the market. She frowned. Why? She asked. Because, he replied, offering her his hand. It's time to start again. Reluctantly, she let him lead her outside. The streets were brighter now, the sun casting long golden beams across the market square. As they walked, people began to notice them, neighbors glancing curiously, shopkeepers pausing mid-sentence. Whispers followed them like shadows. Sundar ignored them all, walking calmly beside her, his hands tucked in his pockets. When they reached the market, he stopped in front of her old stall. It was still there, a wooden table under a torn canopy, empty now, except for a few dusty baskets. She stared at it, her lips pressed together tightly. This was mine, she murmured. But she trailed off. Now it's yours again, Sundar said simply. Before she could respond, several men in uniforms approached, carrying fresh baskets of fruits and vegetables. They began setting up the stall quickly and efficiently, laying out bright red tomatoes, green chilies, glossy eggplants, and bunches of coriander. A boy hung a clean new sign above the canopy, painted neatly with her name. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes filling with tears. What is this? She whispered. A beginning, Sundar replied. You deserve a chance to stand on your own again. She shook her head, overwhelmed. I can't take all this. He turned to her, his expression kind but firm. You can, he said, and you will. Slowly, she reached out and touched the fresh produce, her fingers lingering on the smooth skin of a tomato. Then she straightened her back and turned to him, her eyes wet but steady. Thank you, she said, her voice stronger now. He smiled. Faintly. Don't thank me yet, he said. There's more. She looked confused, but he simply nodded to the boy, who handed her a small velvet box. She opened it hesitantly and gasped. Inside lay a simple gold ring, delicate but beautiful, catching the sunlight in its tiny curve. She shook her head, her voice breaking. No, I can't. Yes, he interrupted gently. You can. It's not just a piece of metal. It's a memory, it's love, and no one should take that away from you. She held the ring in her palm for a long moment, then slipped it onto her finger, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. She looked up at him through tears. I don't know why you care so much, she whispered. He didn't answer at first, only watched her tenderly, his hands folded in front of him. Then he said, almost too quietly for her to hear, because someone once gave me a chance when I thought I had nothing left. The sun rose higher as they began to arrange the stall together. More people gathered, watching in silence as Sue helped her stack tomatoes and weigh chilies, handing out smiles and soft words of encouragement. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some recognized him now. Others just saw kindness in his quiet movements. The grandma stood taller than she had in years, her hands steady as she counted coins and handed change back to customers. A faint color returned to her cheeks, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled, really smiled. When the day grew late and they were packing up, she looked at him with shining eyes and said, You've already done more for me than anyone ever has, but why do I feel like you're still hiding something? He paused, then gave her a small smile. Maybe, he said, or maybe I'm just waiting for the right time. Just as he spoke, a low hum of an engine reached their ears. They both turned to see a black car pulling up slowly to the edge of the square. The whispers in the crowd grew louder as a familiar figure stepped out, the loan shark, his gold chain glinting in the fading light. His lips curled into a cruel smile. He clapped his hands slowly, mockingly, as he walked toward them. You thought it was over? He called out, his voice carrying over the square. You thought you could just walk away? The grandma froze, her hands trembling again. Sundar stepped in front of her, his jaw tight, his eyes darkening. The loan shark stopped a few feet away, his grin widening. "It's just beginning," he said. The air in the market grew heavy, the silence pressing in as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The stormed sound of the loan shark's footsteps echoed in the square as he walked closer, his shoes splashing through shallow puddles left behind by the morning rain. The market, which had been buzzing only moments before, had fallen silent. The shopkeepers stood frozen behind their counters, some clutching their aprons, others whispering to one another, their eyes darting between Sundar and the man in black. Even the children who had been playing nearby stopped, sensing something dangerous in the air. The grandma's breath came quick and shallow as she stood behind Sundar, her hands gripping the edge of the stall so tightly her knuckles turned white. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Sundar glanced over his shoulder just once, his eyes soft when they met hers. "Don't be afraid," he said quietly. Then he turned back toward the man, his expression hardening again. The loan shark stopped just a few feet away, his gold chain catching the light, his dark shirt clinging to his broad shoulders. He smiled, but there was no kindness in it. It was a smile full of mockery, full of threat. "You think you can protect her forever?" he asked, his voice smooth and sharp at the same time. "You don't understand how things work here. You're a stranger. You don't belong." Sundar stood perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, but his eyes were locked on the man. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and low, each word deliberate. "Maybe I don't belong," he said, "but neither does fear, and neither do you." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. The loan shark's grin faltered slightly, then returned. "Brave words," he said, "but words won't save you. Or her." He stepped closer, and the grandma gasped softly, shrinking back. Sun moved too quickly, stepping between them, his shoulders squaring, his body shielding her from view. His voice was sharper now, colder. "You've done enough," he said. "You're finished here." The man's jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly, his face just inches from Sundar's. "You have no idea what you've started," he hissed. "You've humiliated me in front of my people. You think that goes unpunished?" Sundar's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "You think you're strong because you make others afraid," he replied softly, "but fear is weak. Kindness is stronger." The man barked a short, cruel laugh. "Kindness." He spat the word like it was poison. "You'll regret that." He straightened, signaling to the two men waiting by the car. They began to move toward the stall, their hands clenching into fists. The crowd murmured uneasily, but no one stepped forward. Sundar didn't move. His gaze swept the square, the vendors, the children, the neighbors, all standing there, and then back to the man. "Leave," Sundar said simply. "Before you make this worse for yourself." The man tilted his head, confused for just a second by Sundar's steady calm. Then his smile returned, wider this time. "You think you scare me," he said, his voice rising. "You think I care who you are? This is my town, my rules." Sundar's hand slipped into his pocket, his fingers brushing his phone. He looked down briefly, his thumb pressing a button. Then he lifted his eyes again, unflinching. "You don't own anyone," he said. "Not her, not this town." The man opened his mouth to reply, but was cut off by the distant wail of sirens. The sound was faint at first, but growing louder, closer, filling the square with tension. The loan shark froze, his eyes narrowing. The two men by the car hesitated, glancing at each other uncertainly. The sirens grew louder, and within moments 2 police cars screeched to a stop at the edge of the market. Doors slammed. Uniformed officers stepped out, their boots crunching against the stones, their hands resting on their belts. "You called them," the man snarled, his voice low and dangerous now. "You think that changes anything?" Sundar's voice was quiet but clear. "Everything changes," he said. The officers approached, their expressions stern. One of them addressed the loan shark directly. "We've received several complaints about you," he said. "You and your men need to come with us." The loan shark sneered at Sundar, then at the officers. "You think you've won," he spat. "You think this is over. It's not." One of the officers stepped closer. "Enough," he said firmly. "Come with us." With one last glare at Sundar, the man reluctantly raised his hands. The officers took hold of him and his men, escorting them back toward the cars. The crowd began to murmur again, a mix of surprise, relief, and disbelief. Some of the shopkeepers even clapped quietly, though they stopped when the loan shark turned to snarl at them. As the cars drove away, the square seemed to exhale all at once, the tension easing. The grandma let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Sundar turned to her, his expression softening. "It's done," he said gently, but her face remained pale, her eyes wide with worry. "No," she whispered. "It's not." He tilted his head, confused. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "He's not the kind of man who gives up. He'll come back." Sundar studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we'll be ready." That afternoon, Sundar began making calls, quiet, determined calls that no one could hear. He arranged for more help, more support, reaching out to people who owed him favors, people he trusted. Workers came to repair the stall and her house. Deliveries of food and supplies arrived. Neighbors began stopping by, emboldened now, offering small gestures of kindness, a bag of rice, a basket of mangoes, a few rupees tucked into her hand. But that night, as darkness fell and the market emptied, something shifted. The grandma's new stall, freshly stocked and clean, stood alone under the canopy, and in the silence of the night, shadows moved. Sundar had stayed late, walking her home and checking the locks himself before leaving. But hours later, when everyone was asleep, figures slipped into the market. They moved quickly, quietly, cutting the ropes of the canopy, smashing the baskets, trampling the fresh vegetables into the mud. When the first rays of dawn broke over the square, what remained was a ruin, splintered wood, torn cloth, and crushed produce scattered across the stones. The grandma stood in the center of it all, her hands pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaken. Sundar arrived moments later, his expression darkening as he took in the destruction. She turned to him, her voice breaking. "You see," she said, "you can't help me. You can't fight him. He'll never stop." He walked to her, slowly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He wants you to believe that," he said quietly, "but he's wrong." Her tears fell freely now, staining her cheeks. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "I don't want anyone else to get hurt because of me." Sundar crouched down and began gathering the broken pieces of the stall. "No one is getting hurt because of you," he said firmly. "He's already lost. He just doesn't know it yet." She knelt beside him, watching as he began to stack the pieces neatly. "Why do you care so much?" she asked again, her voice soft and tired. Didn't look at her, his hands still working. "Because someone once cared enough to help me stand up when I fell," he said, "and because no one deserves to feel powerless." She stared at him, her heart heavy but a faint ember of hope glowing quietly beneath the weight of fear. That night, as the market settled into silence again, Sundar's phone buzzed on the table. He answered, listened for a few moments without speaking, then stood, his face hardening. He turned to the grandma, who was sitting in the corner of the room, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked up at him, startled by the look in his eyes. "Crossed a line," he said softly. "It ends now." The light night felt heavy, as though the whole town was holding its breath. Outside the small house, the streets were empty, washed in pale moonlight, and the air smelled faintly of dust and rain. Sundar stood at the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the black car parked at the far end of the street. Its engine was silent, but its presence was loud, a threat that hung in the shadows behind him. The grandma sat quietly on her cot, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched Sundar's silhouette, tall and still against the faint glow of the window, and felt both fear and a strange sense of safety. For so many months, she had felt invisible. Now, here was someone who refused to look away. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly, her voice barely carrying across the small room. He didn't turn his head, but his voice came steady and low. "Yes," he said. "They've had their chance." She rose slowly, crossing the floor until she stood just behind him. She could see his reflection in the glass, his eyes sharp, his jaw tight, and for the first time, she realized just how much strength he carried in his silence. "You don't have to fight for me," she murmured. He turned then, and his eyes softened when they met hers. "I already promised you," he said gently. "You're not alone anymore." The sound of a car door slamming outside broke the quiet. Sundar straightened, his eyes narrowing as he watched the figures step out of the black car. The loan shark and two of his men. They stood under the streetlight, their faces hard and angry, their shadows stretching long across the stones. The loan shark raised his hand, and the two men began walking toward the house. Slow and deliberate, Sundar stepped outside before they reached the door, closing it softly behind him. The grandma pressed her hands to her chest, watching through the crack in the wood, her breath quick and shallow. In the street, Sundar walked calmly toward them, his hands in his pockets, his steps quiet but certain. He stopped in the center of the road, waiting. The loan shark smirked as he approached, his gold chain catching the moonlight. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" The man sneered. "I could say the same to you," Sundar replied, his voice calm. The loan shark chuckled darkly and shook his head. "You think you've won. You called the police, embarrassed me in front of everyone, but they can't protect you forever. You don't understand how this works. Men like me, we always win." Sundar's expression didn't change. He took a slow breath, then said quietly, "Not tonight." Before the man could reply, the sound of more engines filled the street. Another car appeared at the corner, then another. Bright headlights cut through the dark as several black SUVs pulled up and stopped behind Sundar. Doors opened, and men in crisp suits stepped out one by one, their movements quiet and efficient. They carried nothing but authority, and their presence seemed to drain the confidence from the loan shark's grin. One of the suited men approached Sundar and spoke softly. "Everything is ready," he said. Sundar nodded once and turned back. To the loan shark, you're finished here, he said firmly. The loan shark laughed, though the sound was weaker now. Who do you think you are? He demanded. You think you can just come here and take everything from me? Sundar stepped closer until they stood face to face. His eyes didn't waver, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the night. You already took enough from her, he said. But now it ends. The suited men moved in, surrounding the loan shark and his men. The grandma watched from the doorway as the police arrived a few moments later, flashing lights bouncing off the walls. The loan shark struggled, shouting threats, but no one paid him any mind. The officers cuffed him and led him away, his voice growing smaller and smaller as he was pushed into the back of a car. The crowd that had gathered began to clap softly, hesitant at first, then louder, until the square was filled with applause. Neighbors stepped forward, patting Sundar on the back, murmuring thanks, offering shy smiles. The grandma stood frozen in the doorway, tears spilling down her cheeks. Sundar turned and walked back toward her. She stared at him as though seeing him for the first time, not just as a man who bought tea in the rain, but as something more. Why did you really do this? She asked quietly when he reached her. He looked down at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Because, he said softly, once, someone believed in me when no one else did, and they showed me that kindness can change everything. Tonight, you reminded me of that. Her tears fell faster now, and she reached out to take his hand. You've given me everything, she whispered. You already had everything, he replied gently. You just needed someone to remind you. Next morning, the market was alive with color again. The grandma's stall had been repaired overnight, stronger, brighter, with fresh produce stacked neatly. A new canopy shaded the table, and a small sign above it read simply, Uma's Vegetables. The grandma stood tall behind her stall, greeting customers with a smile that lit up her entire face. Neighbors stopped by to wish her well, buying handfuls of chilies and mangoes just to speak to her. Sundar stood quietly at the edge of the square, watching her with a small smile. She caught his eye and waved, and he nodded before turning to leave. She called out after him, will you come back? He paused and glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes warm. Always, he said. That afternoon, after the crowd had thinned, and the sun began to sink behind the rooftops, the grandma found a small envelope resting on her stall. Inside was a letter written in simple, graceful handwriting. She unfolded it carefully, her fingers trembling as she read. Dear Amma, you reminded me that strength is quiet and kindness is powerful. You showed me what it means to keep going even when the world feels heavy. The world needs more people like you. Thank you for letting me be part of your story. I will never forget you. Sundar. She folded the letter slowly, pressing it to her chest, her eyes filling with tears and a smile breaking through all at once. She looked around the market, feeling the warmth of the people, the sound of laughter, the smell of spices and fresh bread filling the air. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt whole. Outside the market, Sundar walked down the narrow road, his figure growing smaller with each step, until he disappeared into the golden light of the setting sun. And still, in the center of the market, the grandma stood holding the letter, her heart full of quiet pride, her stall alive with the soft hum of life returning, in the faint memory of kindness that had changed everything.